Hi, and welcome to TECM 5195. Today we're going to be talking about audience analysis, and this will be really helpful as you are completing your final projects, your final comprehensive edits. Part of that, one of the components of that final project is to conduct an audience analysis, and then as part of the recommendation report, include the audience analysis results in the report. So just a quick agenda of what we'll cover. We're going to quickly define audience analysis. If you've ever taken a technical communication course or if you're teaching a technical communication course, you're certainly familiar with the term. But I want to approach audience analysis from a bit different way than some of the textbooks approach it. So I want to define that. I want to look at some approaches, and then I want to talk about specifically reporting audience analysis to clients. Like, how do we report what we're finding? And then I want to tie this to our recommendation report. So what is audience analysis? I would argue that audience analysis is primarily a research method, which isn't really what the textbooks would argue, but I think that's what they're saying without actually explicitly saying that. And so I would argue that audience analysis is primarily a research method for systematically gathering and analyzing information about our intended audiences. Okay, so it's a way of understanding and learning about our audiences, but the audience analysis part of it really is hopefully a systematic method. So since audience analysis, I'm arguing, is this systematic way of understanding and gathering information about our audience, I want to present to you a CATA model of data-driven audience analysis. And CATA stands for collect, analyze, triangulate, and apply. And this is a model that I came up with and that I use in my classes to teach students about collecting and analyzing data. But before we can get into the CATA model, first I think we need to, as editors and as technical communicators, it's important to first identify your audience. And really we're thinking about audience in this case, in the identify stage, really generally, right? So who's your primary audience? Who's the main decision maker or stakeholder? Who's your secondary audience? Who are some other people that will read this piece of communication and also potentially make a decision? And then who's your tertiary audience? Who are the people that may read this but don't really have a decision-making ability or stake? So for example, if you think about a marketing website, primary audience is going to be a customer, right? So we're thinking very generally. Our secondary audience might be family members of a customer, right? Someone that makes a decision, like a parent. So I'm thinking as a parent, something that's trying to sell, a website that's trying to sell a new toy to a kid. Well, the primary stakeholder may be the actual parent who has the money. Secondary stakeholder might be the child, depending on the age of the child. And then tertiary stakeholder might be a family member, like an uncle or an aunt who is going to purchase a toy for this child, right? So when we're talking about in the identify stage, we're really talking generally, very generally, who are our main audiences and stakeholders. And then what we do is we want to get into more specifically, what do we know about parents? What are their age ranges? Are they typically men or women? What do they value? What are their motivations for purchasing? What are their attitudes towards purchasing? Right? And so really, that's where the CATA model gets into more details. So the CATA model is collect, right? So once you've identified your primary, secondary, and tertiary stakeholders, you want to collect information about them. You want to learn more about them. So you want to gather as much as you can. The A stands for analyze. Once you've got all this information, you have to sort of synthesize it and come up with what's meaningful here. Is there a pattern here, or is it just random? So for example, 8 out of 10 people visiting this particular website tend to be women, right? So we're analyzing that. Now we're starting to get some patterns and some information out of the data. Triangulate. So if you've got a lot of different data sources, so maybe you've looked on social media, maybe you looked at competitor websites, maybe you conducted a survey and some interviews, you've got 3 different data sets. Triangulating is really looking at all of the data and saying, which of these makes sense together? What information or data corroborates other information and data? And then apply. What are you going to actually do with the communication? How does this change the way that you're writing? Or how does this change the way that you're designing? Okay, so that's sort of a high-level overview of the CADA model. What I want to do now is contextualize the CADA model for editing specifically. But before I do that, I want to quickly talk about teaching CADA. So I would encourage you to teach this framework or some variation of this framework to your students if you're teaching technical communication. So this idea of collecting, analyzing, triangulating, applying is a framework that I would argue can and should be applied to any technical communication decision, not just audience analysis. So anytime you're making a decision, if you're writing a recommendation report, for example, right, following this framework where you're gathering and analyzing the data and teaching that to students. And then secondly, I would argue teaching data-driven methods creates a culture of quote-unquote research, right? And so there's a difference between research in the academic sense and research in the workplace sense. And so, and then also there's a third way to look at research, and that's like, I Googled it. There's internet research, right? And so as teachers, we want to teach students that there is some standard of research and there's data involved in research. It's not the same as academic research, but it's important to think through data sources, analyzing data, triangulating data, and then ultimately applying data. So collecting audience data as an editor. So as an editor, it's a little bit different than if you were the primary writer or author of the content, because presumably the primary writer and author of the content has already identified an audience and has already conducted an audience analysis. So as an editor, I think we're going to rely much less on primary research sources. But we definitely want to do at least, we definitely want to ask ourselves at least three primary questions. First, what are my audience's wants, needs, and attitudes? That seems like an innocuous question, but that's a really hard question to ask unless you really know your audience, right? And so you should be able to answer that. Secondly, what are my audience's motivations? Why are they motivated to read this particular piece of content? So the first question I would say is more general. What are their wants, needs, and attitudes? The second question is more specific. Why are they motivated to read this piece of content in the first place? And then thirdly, how and when will my audience interact with this information? So really thinking about context. Will it be on a screen? Will it be on a mobile device? Will it be on paper? Will they be stressed out? Will they be in a rush? Right? All of those things matter in terms of how we're writing, designing, and creating content. After you've asked the right questions, you've got to answer those questions, right? And there's really three ways to gather information to answer those questions. There's intuition, right? So parents, I'm a parent, so I have an intuition about, okay, parents typically want to know if this is healthy for their child. Or parents typically want to know if this is safe for their child, right? There's certain wants and motivations and needs that a parent needs that I know because I'm a parent. So intuition is helpful, my own intuition. Secondly, we can look at secondary research. So we can do internet searches, we can look on message boards. There's a million parenting websites and message boards. We can look on social media. Twitter's got a great open access search function. We can look at competitor websites or competitors, right? So if we're analyzing or editing a website, for example, we can look at a website that's similar to our website, and we can look to see what they're doing. So we can do some secondary research, and then there's primary research. Right? We can identify. Okay, we know that our target audience is parents. We can survey and interview a group of parents. Right? There's obvious advantages and disadvantages to each of these. There's limitations to each of these. As an editor, I would say you're going to rely primarily on intuition and secondary research. There's going to be very little primary research unless you're being hired to do primary research. Right? Again, you have to think about your role as an editor. And then just a quick teaching tip. As we're talking about collecting data, we can teach students the pitfalls of only relying on intuition, right? Oftentimes what happens with audience analysis is we think we know our audience and we just come up with, oh, they must be kind of like this. They probably value X, Y, and Z. And while sometimes that's helpful, oftentimes there's limitations. We have our own personal biases, or we have our own personal worldviews in which we're filtering out information. And so it's important to balance our data sources. So as we're teaching this, it's important to say, hey, all three of these data sources are important. Finally, analyzing it, I've combined the A and the T in the model, analyzing, triangulating audience data. Because as an editor, again, we're not working with a whole lot of data sources. I'm not asking you to conduct primary research. So we're really focusing on intuition here and on secondary research. So because you won't be collecting primary data, you probably won't be doing statistical analyses. But there's other things you can do, like look for patterns in the data you've gathered. So as you're answering questions through your own intuition, as you're looking up information via secondary research, what are some patterns that are emerging? There always seems to be, all the competitors' websites seem to use a blue background. Well, maybe there's something to that, right? So looking at some patterns and analyzing that. Secondly, corroborating your intuitions, what you think your audience is going to want, need, and think, versus the secondary data that you've gathered, right? And so what lines up? So yeah, I felt like parents really rely on or value healthy and safe choices for their kids. All of the competitor websites seem to focus on healthy and safe choices, right? So those are corroborated. And then consider the limitations of the data you've gathered, right? And so some of this might just be anecdotal, or a lot of it might be anecdotal. And just consider that before making. So what I mean is you don't want to totally gut in someone's document or suggest to the writer or author to completely rearrange a document if you've just found, two websites seem to have a blue background. So you're going to tell your author to change the website background to blue. Well, that's probably not an appropriate conclusion. Quick teaching takeaway. You can teach students that, and I'll tell you this just as a point of me teaching to you, that your own intuitions are in fact data, right? It's a data, you are a data point, but it's a highly flawed and limited data point because it's just one person and it's yourself. And so it's a way also to teach about limitations of data, right? So really thinking critically through data. And so that's sort of a data literacy, information literacy principle that you can teach or add on into your own teaching. Finally, applying audience data. Got a picture of a bridge here. And so I really, when I teach students about the CATA framework, the application, the last A, is the most important part of this framework. Without it, it's like removing this bridge from this picture. You've got all of this great information, but you do nothing with it. You can't get to the other side. You're not applying any of it without this last stage. And so this last stage is super important. And so I would argue for making one-to-one connections. And what I mean by one-to-one connections is a specific finding or data point that you've found in your audience analysis and connecting it to either writing, visual design, or content. Okay, so these are three large categories or buckets of editorial changes or suggestions that you can make. So for writing, you could make revisions or suggestions about style and tone, about organization, things like cohesion. Those are all things that you can make suggestions about that you would want to tie your audience analysis directly to. Visual design. these are just some examples. This is not comprehensive, but these are some examples of things you can make revisions or suggestions for revisions to. Page layout choices, right? So, oh, it would look better as a 2-column versus a 1-column, or all the competitors seem to use 3-column layout. Maybe we should consider 3-column layout. Formatting choices, right? So we should introduce more headings, or we should increase the font size or decrease the font size. Color choices. What color scheme should you be considering? What does color evoke for this particular audience? And then font choices, right? So there's always that great example of using Comic Sans for some serious piece of communication, right? The font you choose actually has a really large impact on the overall perception of the content itself. So visual design changes, and then the third bucket is content/rhetorical changes, right? So this is really thinking through, is the content even appropriate for our audience, right? So if parents are focusing on safe and healthy choices for their children, and you haven't mentioned safe and healthy one time on the website, well, that's a content change, right? You're not revising a sentence or editing a sentence because that sentence doesn't exist in there. So it's really looking at the cohesion of arguments, foregrounding certain content or backgrounding certain content, right? So these are the kinds of changes you would make as an editor that I'm arguing you should make one-to-one connections via your audience analysis. Okay, so I've talked sort of generally or abstractly about the one-to-one. Let's look at a specific example. And this is pretty high level. Hopefully you have more detailed information about your audience. But here's one data point where we can sort of tie it into writing, visual design, and content rhetoric, those categories. So maybe you've done an audience analysis and you've decided, okay, our primary audience is a younger audience from 15 to 19. They value social issues, and you're editing a website for volunteer opportunities in the area. Well, because we know they're a younger audience and we've done some research and we found, well, they prefer an informal tone. So let's edit for informal tone. Make sure that the tone of the prose is informal. We want to make sure it's easy to read. Visual design. Well, we may have found younger folks in that age range really preferred, or maybe through a competitive analysis, we've looked at other websites, really preferred more sincere and genuine looking images and not stock photos. So maybe we want to use visually only real photos that we can find from social media or that we take ourselves, as opposed to stock photos. And then in the content, maybe we want to focus on the larger benefit to society and less on the logistics and features, right? So maybe on a volunteer website, it's got all these, you can sign up on Tuesdays and orientations on Wednesday, and you have to do a minimum of 4-hour shifts. Maybe this particular audience is less invested in those logistical details and more interested in the larger benefits to society. So from a content perspective, maybe we can focus on that. Okay, so a few final takeaways for editing and teaching. Really 3 things. The purpose of audience analysis is actionable decisions about the work product, right? These one-to-one connections. So you've learned X about your audience. What does that have to do with writing, design, or content, right? And so it's not an academic exercise, and this is important to teach your students. I'm not making you do an audience analysis just to do one. So you've got a profile of your audience and you know a bunch about your audience, but you're not actually doing anything to the document itself. And so that's really important. Secondly, to teach them some data is almost always better than no data when it comes to audience, right? So it's always better to think critically about your audience or collect some secondary research about your audience as opposed to just assuming, oh, they must like it this way. I like it this way, they must like it this way. And finally, our preconceptions and intuitions have major limitations, right? So we don't want to only rely on our intuitions, but we also want to be triangulating with secondary and primary research if possible. So that's it. Thanks.